go straight to your questions. Please introduce yourselves. Just say which media outlet you represent here. I don't know which language we're doing this, in Russian probably, or Russian English. I am ready to answer you in English. Well, probably not Arabic, there's no need for it. Well, that's the usual way we work. You're welcome.
Maria Ivnovna, Russia Today television. Russia confirmed that it received from Syria what the Syrian government calls the evidence that the radical rebels are behind the attack here last month. And we heard from Foreign Minister Lavrov that Russia is ready to hand it over to the UN Security Council. Could you please give us more details on what kind of evidence is this and when exactly Russia will transfer it to the UN Security Council? Thank you.
I think there is still a little bit of a confusion with regard to this issue. We have indeed received additional evidence collected, analyzed, and concluded upon by the Syrian authorities on what they believe is proof for use of chemical weapons by insurgents, so-called insurgents, both in eastern Ghouta on August 21st, but also on August 22nd, 23rd, and 24th incidents. This is nothing new. This is not something that makes headlines. This evidence was earlier handed over to Mr. Åke Sellström, who was here in Syria, leading the group of experts from the UN. Those experts, as we all know, departed Syria several days ago, and this evidence is with them, and we are disappointed that there is no due attention paid to this evidence in the report which the group presented in New York earlier this week. This evidence, which was also shared by the Syrian Authority with Russian delegation in the course of our meetings yesterday and today, is a very factual one. It comprises of results of analysis, results of studies of samples, biological samples collected in the area where those 4 incidents took place. It's really premature for us to conclude what we have there. This material was handed over to us in Arabic. We have completed translation of this evidence into Russian. We, as a small group representing Russian Foreign Ministry, are in no way responsible for the contents of it, both in terms of what we saw from the Syrian party, but even more so on what eventual conclusions the Russian side may draw. This is the case for further studies by the experts. It will take some time. There is no rush here, but it will, I'm sure, accompany and supplement and reinforce some views which were well known, made well known by Russia in the course of the discussions in New York, that one cannot simply be as flawed and as one-sided as we have seen, laying full responsibility for incident in Ghouta upon the Syrian government.
Sir?
Yes, please.
Семен Пегов, телеканал Life News, газета «Известия». Сергей Александрович, такой вопрос. Вы сегодня встречались с президентом Сирии Башаром Асадом. Какие конкретно обсуждались вопросы, какое послание или с какими предложениями наша российская сторона пришла сегодня к президенту?
Мы признательны за эту возможность. Для меня
very grateful for this opportunity. It was a great honor for me to be received by the President of Syria. We continued talking, the same talk that we have been we've been leading with other leaders, and we shared some very important assessments and opinions. All this will be reported to Moscow in detail. And just as in all of our talks here in Damascus, we talked about the prospects of reaching a full agreement and implementation of the agreements that were reached in Geneva with the participation of the Foreign Minister of Russia and his colleague from the United States. And these agreements actually set the track for the further effort in implementing in practice the decision for this country to become a part of the Chemical Weapons Convention. And another important aspect, another important agenda that was discussed, as you understand, it's about the prospects for the situation settlement through the continued process, which is called Geneva II.
Can I ask you, sorry, in Arabic or English?
If we do have an interpreter, Arabic-Russian, I would be gladly answering your question as translated in Russian and then translated further back into Arabic. I don't know where the interpreter is. Maybe for the sake of time, I'll come back to you in a moment, but before that, I'll take another question.
In English.
Okay, all right.
What is the most important documents provided by the Syrian government about the insurgent use of chemical weapons?
Those documents are very factual and very technical. There is no political distort in these documents, I would say. This is actually, charts, numbers, conclusions in terms of chemical formulas and things like this, but not being able to share this with experts in Moscow who have better understanding on all this stuff compared to what I have, I would refrain from giving any characters. What we have been impressed by, though, is a very factual approach to it, and this is something that we intend to study very carefully, and hopefully it will also underpin the point that everything should be investigated. Sellstrom's people should come back to Syria as early as practicable, and these conclusions, which we all heard from New York the day before yesterday and also yesterday, those conclusions are limited in scope, and to some extent they are not sufficient, and by all means they are premature. We need to see the whole picture in its totality. We need to have a comprehensive conclusion before we end up with something as far-reaching as signals that were heard from New York the day before yesterday.
Thank you.
Сергей Александрович, такой вопрос для нас, российских журналистов, очень актуальный. Вы наверняка в курсе тех боевых действий, которые ведутся в Сирии, и в частности
armed actions in Syria and in a Christian village of Malula, where the terrorists took Christian monastery hostage. Does our diplomatic mission follow the situation? How would you comment on it?
We certainly follow it. More than that, we closely deal with the situation in practical terms. Earlier, I should say, we issued a statement on this, quite a detailed statement. You can look it up on the Foreign Ministry website. I realize that, well, it's not usual to talk with journalists like that during press conferences, but I can give you this as an example of our responsible approach to all aspects of the situation that is developing here. We're very much concerned with how people feel here in Syria, including people of all different confessions, religions, and we're very concerned with the fate of the Christian community. And after there has been a period of ever-growing threats and concerns. Here, now, in this region, to a certain extent, the conditions have been restored, and the authorities of the Syrian Republic now see this improvement, this positive development with relief, and we're going to continue working on the situation and improving it towards the solution of this situation or all other problems, like problems of the Kurds in the north of the country, through the political negotiations and through talking with the Syrian opposition and National Front, a National Coordination Committee that I just had a meeting with here in the Russian embassy to Syria, and we have received an understanding, a confirmation of the understanding from not the government but the opposition groups that the only way forward is the way through Geneva II. We should stop tag of war and start negotiating through having delegations talk to each other. The delegations, which include the delegations of the oppositions, we should start up the dialogue, which would involve also the Syrian government, as we heard from the Syrian government, who also confirms their readiness to follow the track of convening the Geneva II meeting. And this readiness should be met with the same kind of openness and no preconditions from all the opposition sides and parties, and we are going to continue our work along this track.
Iteritas Agency, could you tell us how would you explain today's Russian-Syrian relations?
Syrian-Russian relations are the relations of partnership, friendship, the relations that have roots that go back, and they also have a good future. We cooperate in different areas and on many issues. We stand for working closely together with the government of Syria, and also, I will emphasize that, also with the opposition, to find a way which would be for the benefit of all the involved parties, for relieving the situation. The friendship between Russia and Syria cannot be shaken, and there's nothing that can ruin it or undermine it. This friendship has stood through very difficult times, and I have no doubt it will stand firm further on.
Syrian television, the Russian President Putin has stated previously that Russia will continue helping Syria politically, economically, and in the defense area. How would that be executed practically? Another question: what will be Russia's position in terms of draft resolution on Syria prepared by France and other countries?
I'll start with your second question, since this was an important part of our today's discussion and yesterday's discussion with the representatives of the government of Syria. We follow the positions of the Geneva Convention, the document within Russia and the USA, and if we give up the attempts to rewrite it or reinterpret to a one side, but instead to keep working along it like Russia does, it's easy. The important and the nearest milestone would be now to make a decision of the Executive Committee of the Organization for the Prohibition of the Chemical Weapons to be the starting point for the implementation of the negotiations reached on the elimination of the chemical weapons. after this decision is made by the Executive Committee of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons is made, it would be imperative to implement all the supportive measures of this decision through the resolution of the UN, which would mean Russia and the United States, as captured in the document in Geneva on the 14th of September, in addition to the signal, which I just mentioned. It would also need to include the measures to provide security and safety for the experts for the Chemical Weapons Organization. And the third important thing would be to supply additional resources that the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons might not have in order to reach the implementation of all these agreements within the very challenging time frame. That's it. Nothing else. As for the Russia's support and effort, it involves, first of all, a very close negotiation and cooperation, as well as involvement of the experts in implementing this plan. And we keep working in all the areas that you all very well know of. There's no need to mention them again. We are committed to working together with Damascus in these areas. This decision stays.
What about terms of implementation?
The time frame for work, for what? The Geneva Agreement says that until the end of the first quarter of the next year.
The UN has always been saying the numbers of lost in the 110,000 of people who died in the Syrian conflict. I decided to find out where the numbers came from, because the Russian government never gave any numbers. I found a website where the opposition posts the names of their victims. As you know, I was captured, so I found the names of people representing the other side. Is the fact that the UN keeps giving numbers of losses on one side only, do you think it's an index of bias positioned by the UN in terms of... Do you think the UN is sort of taking sides?
So the question as to where the sources are of where the numbers come from and where other information like data comes from, this question should be asked to those who are the authors or publishers of this information. As for our assessments, indeed, here we deal with the situation when there is no really conclusive information as speaking about the materials that the UN works with, the materials that they disseminated throughout the expert commission, there is no conclusive information as of now. We know that there is a large amount of evidence and information coming from different sources, independent of each other, and totally independent of Russia. And we also consider this information and hand it over to the UN, and we hope for the UN to carefully and in an unbiased way to consider this information. As you just said, we need to join our efforts in order to create or recreate the picture of what had happened. Two more questions, please.
What about the first question of our Syrian colleague? You didn't reply to that. Well, yes, I did. No, I did reply that what we're doing is our help. We're not going to wrap everything up. We're going to continue our work, and our priority is implementation of the agreements reached in Geneva. That's what I've said in quite a clear manner. How likely you think it is that America will invade Syria?
I do not represent the administration of the United States. I do not tell fortune. I cannot give you any assessments or any evaluation of this kind. I'm not authorized. I can only say that the agreements that we reached in Geneva, they give a chance for a peaceful diplomatic settlement. And this is confirmed by the officers of highest rank in the United States, and we share this position, and we would like this chance to be seized and to be implemented in practice that would make other options unnecessary.
According to the agreements in Geneva between Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Kerry, during 1 week, according to the decisions, the Syrian party should provide the data on the amount of chemical weapons and the places of their storage. Did the Syrian side supply Russia with such data, and can we find out anything about that?
Well, Russia does not have to give this. Russia has undertaken the responsibility to follow the Chemical Weapons Convention, and as of its own goodwill, will continue working on implementing these measures. What we're doing here in Damascus, in agreement with the Geneva Convention, until Syria becomes part of this convention, which is going to happen on the 14th of September. This term officially captured by the convention starts from the 14th of September for the Syria to join the convention. And this information that you just mentioned, according to the Geneva Agreement, must be implemented within a week. And this has to be reported to The Hague. This is where this information is going to be reported to The Hague. And we just made a statement that it will be done timely, but we cannot, in no way can we do this bypassing the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons.
Just one question. Sorry, do you expect to convince or check the Geneva 2 at the end next month, according to Lakhdar Ibrahimi?
We are ready. We are prepared to be in Geneva at Geneva 2, or be it at Geneva 2, wherever it may be convened, at any moment that is acceptable for everyone. And this is exactly the problem. We do not see the sufficient results of the work of our partners at this process, the US in particular, in terms of bringing together the opposition that may appear at this conference. And thus, we have delays of convening this conference. But more importantly, the representation of opposition should be broad, should not be limited to some forces that only represent so-called Doha opposition. We think people like those with whom we met in the course of our meetings today are someone who are well-placed, well-connected, who are representing very substantial parts of Syrian society, and they completely and fully deserve their right place at negotiating table. And this is the trick which should be, addressed. This is the fix which is needed. Before we do so, it would be too early to mention particular dates when this meeting, this conference can start. Thank you very much. Спасибо большое.
We were listening there to a press conference being held by Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, who said that, well, he was very critical, in fact, of the UN inspector's report into the alleged use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government. That interpretation from the US in the suburbs of Damascus on August the 21st. He said that it was actually very limited in scope and not sufficient. He said that Russia has now been handed information from the Syrian government which suggests that rebels had actually used chemical weapons themselves on August the 21st, the 23rd and 24th. And he said that this information had actually been handed to the chief UN inspector, Aki Selstrom, but it appears that it was not acted upon. So very strong words there. Let's bring in RT's Alexei Yaroshevsky. He didn't mince his words at all, did he?
Yeah, very strong wording. I mean, the bottom line of what Mr. Ryabkov just said is that Russia does not believe the accusations and claims by the United States and several Western countries that the chemical weapons were in fact used by Bashar al-Assad's forces. In fact, Mr. Ryabkov says that definitive proof of rebel forces using the chemical weapons were handed over first to the UN inspectors some time ago, so weeks ago. And this was not taken into the inconclusive, as he described it, report by the United Nations inspectors. Now this evidence, and this is not, we're not talking about some guesses or just, inconclusive evidence. This is, according to Ryabkov, factual evidence, biosamples and documents proving that the chemicals were in fact used by the rebel forces. Now they've been handed over to the Russian side, and all they're waiting now for is these documents to be completely translated from Arabic into Russian before Moscow can fully assess what's in this proof and make it completely public. But definitely Ryabkov has been very regretful about the fact that the UN inspectors are not taking this kind of evidence into consideration. Let's listen to what Mr. Ryabkov had to say.
We have indeed received additional evidence collected, analyzed and concluded upon by the Syrian authorities on what they believe is proof for use of chemical weapons by insurgents, so-called insurgents, both in eastern Ghouta on August 21st, but also on August 22nd, 23rd, and 24th incidents. This is nothing new. This is not something that makes headlines. This evidence was earlier handed over to Mr. Åke Sellström, who was here in Syria, leading the group of experts from the UN. Those experts, as we all know, departed Syria several days ago, and this evidence is with them, and we are disappointed that there is no due attention paid to this evidence in the report which the group presented in New York earlier this week.
So according to Mr. Ryabkov, this kind of evidence can actually change the whole course of negotiations, can actually change the whole Geneva II concept. This basically, what he said today, in large way reiterates what his boss, the foreign minister of Russia, Mr. Lavrov, said earlier. Let's listen to what he said.
We have a lot of information about the August chemical attack in Ghouta. We'll examine all of this at the Security Council, along with the UN chemical weapons report. We still have to figure out who is behind the attack, but let me just reiterate that we have a great deal of information to work with.
Another very important point made by Ryabkov is that Russia will still continue to insist on holding the Geneva II conference, which is the only peaceful solution to the Syrian conflict as Moscow sees it, and hopes to have this conference in the nearest future, though it's no set date for the conference as so far.
OK, thank you, Alexei. That's RT's Alexei Yaroshevsky. Well, let's get more reaction to this. We can now speak to journalist and author Robert Harness. I think you can hear me. Thank you very much for coming on to the programme. Yes. I assume perhaps you were able to listen to that press conference too. It's very clear that Russia wants the UN Security Council to examine new data implicating the Syrian rebels in the chemical attacks. Do you think they'll be willing to examine it, considering it has come from the Syrian government?
Well, I think sooner or later, we're really not talking about the United Nations Security Council. We're talking about the West, France, Britain and Russia, and the United States. They're going to have to listen to the evidence that is coming out. Their statements could only have been the Syrian government that did this. Frankly, evidence that the rebels had sarin gas in Turkey. There was a court hearing only 2 days ago on the subject. They were arrested by the Turkish police. You have other reports from journalists who were there saying that actually it wasn't the Syrian government, it was the rebels. And now you have this growing body of technical evidence. Now, of course, it's very difficult to prove anything in this sort of atmosphere, but it is also, it seems to me, becoming very difficult for the Western pressure within the United Nations Security Council to continue to be effective.
Well, another interesting point that came out of the press conference is that Russia says the UN was handed plenty of data to examine, yet it wasn't reflected in their report. Why do you think it was ignored?
Well, I'd like to start from a slightly different point. Professor Sellstrom, who led the mission to deal with the question, spent a short time in Syria, is a person who some people believe is not as unbiased as he might be, and that he is too close to Western nations and too close to NATO. The Russians, on the other hand, are being very circumspect. Yes, they did say what you say, but they're not actually being as rude as they could be. But it's quite clear that they are not impressed by the amount of bias that they feel is being shown.
He's asked the UN inspectors to come back. Do you think they will?
I think they'll have to. I think it will be too embarrassing not to. This whole issue has gone off at a tangent. I mean, what is weird is in the background the Syrian civil war continues, and yet this huge noisy debate about chemical weapons also goes on. I think the United Nations, for its own credibility, will have to send people back.